Picture yourself back in your grade school classroom. I don't care if it's elementary school, middle school, high school. Just put yourself back there for a second. Look around the classroom. Do you see any kids with and without disabilities studying together and learning together? Raise your hand if you do see that. One or two. A couple of people in a room of about 100. Okay. Did you have a best friend who had a disability? A significant disability. A few people. Okay. Did you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend that had a significant disability? One person, two people. Okay, in a room of 100. All right, let's be honest for a second. Did you feel some fear or nervousness when you were a kid about talking to a kid with a disability? Raise your hand if you felt some fear or nervousness. Okay, probably a majority of the room. We have something in common. I felt exactly the same way. Disability, honestly, was just a blip on the radar screen for me. It was not a big part of my life. Met my wife. We had our first son, Isaiah. Isaiah is one of these kids that at 10 months, he was walking, he was talking, he was always ahead of the curve. And then Samuel came along. He's cute, isn't he? I'm biased. I think he's very cute. I was thrilled. We had another boy. My wife, Betsy, and I were like, we know how to do boys. This is great. We could do boys. And I started envisioning all the things that they would do together like I did with my brother. Playing baseball, wrestling, going hiking as a family with my sister and my parents. And I just started, it was wonderful to kind of envision this in my mind until we noticed a few things. And one of the first things we noticed were his hands. And if you look closely at the picture, you see his hands are balled up in a fist. That's not really typical. So we went to Samuel's pediatrician and we said, listen, we're seeing some things that are different with Samuel. What should we do? And he said, listen, kids develop in different ways. Don't worry about it. Let's just play it by ear. But just to be sure, let's go see a neurologist to make sure there's nothing wrong. Okay, we get a little nervous about that step. We see the neurologist. He does lots of blood samples, skin samples. And a few weeks later, I get a phone call, and the neurologist says, Mr. Habib, I think your son has a mitochondrial disorder. Let's get together in a few weeks and talk about it. So I did what no parent should do, but every parent would do. Want to guess? Google mitochondrial disorder, of course. And the first thing that came up was usually fatal. And I felt like I was kicked in the stomach. And I remember thinking, what does this mean? What is this going to mean for our life? Now, thankfully, I now know there are thousands of mitochondrial disorders that have lots of different ramifications. But in Samuel's case, it did cause cerebral palsy. So suddenly we were on this journey that we never, ever expected to be on. So every night, my wife and I would be together at the dinner table, and we would be talking to each other. What did Samuel do today? Did he roll over at all? Was he sitting up? Was he talking at all? Just trying to see, is there some sign that he's getting better? I remember a physical therapist telling me, if you massage him each night, it might loosen up his muscles. So I would do those massages. And on the nights when I forgot to do that massage, I would beat myself up. I'd feel so guilty that I wasn't doing what I needed to do to fix him. We started wondering, what's his life going to be like in school, in the community, relationships, work, college? How can he go to college when he can't even hold a pencil? How can he play with his friends when he can't just run outside? It was completely overwhelming. Over time, we finally came to terms with the fact that Samuel had a disability, and he would have a disability, a lifelong disability. So what do we do now? And what we realized we had to do was create a vision for Samuel and let him create a vision for himself. So what would that vision be? The vision that became obvious to us was that we needed to make sure that he felt like he belonged. That he belonged in our neighborhood, that he belonged in our community, and perhaps more than anything, that he belonged in his local school. Because how can you feel like you belong in your community if you don't feel like you belong in your own neighborhood school, which is the hub of the community? So that got us thinking about inclusion, because for him to go to his local school would mean they would have to work to include him. Now, luckily, Samuel's a charmer. And a bit of a flirt. So in preschool, that wasn't that difficult, right? He was completely included in preschool. He belonged, no doubt. In elementary school, he was fully included in general education classrooms. He was supported, sometimes quite literally, by an expanding circle of friends. He belonged in that general education classroom, there was no doubt. He joined the Scouts. He acted in school theater. When other kids were speaking their lines, Samuel used the communication device mounted on his wheelchair to speak his lines. And that was normal. That's what he'd been doing all day long with his peers in school. For him, that stage was a place where he belonged. Samuel is a big baseball fan. And he started playing baseball with T-ball right up through coach pitch league, and he loved it. And we loved watching the joy in his face. And then came the age where he was going to be in the league where kids are pitching the ball quite fast, where kids are actually hitting the ball over the fence at times. And he wanted to play. So I thought, oh my gosh, how is he going to play at this level? And I remember getting together with the league president and saying, Joe, listen, Samuel wants to play in this level. I don't really know what that's going to look like. You know, should we send a letter home to families? Should we make this statement about inclusion? Should we have some communication throughout the league? And he said, Dan, slow down. Listen, if a kid in our community wants to play baseball, he's going to play baseball. End of story. I just said, wow, that's all I could ask for. So he played. Oh yeah, he played. He would get up there, he'd hit the ball off the tee when the other kids were playing, hitting off a pitch. He would go like a bat out of hell down that first base line in his bicycle with a little help from a coach. If he was out, he was out. If he was safe, he was safe. He was playing baseball. He belonged on that field. Now in middle school, Samuel has a great circle of friends in 8th grade. He's in general education in all his classes, and he's on the honor roll. Now, if you're surprised by that he's on the honor roll, don't be. Because Samuel represents the statistics that we have built over 35 years around inclusive education. The statistics have shown that kids with disabilities who are included in general education classrooms have better outcomes socially, academically, in terms of behavior, in terms of post-school outcomes, in terms of everything you can imagine. Advocate for inclusive education in your communities and schools. Advocate for inclusive education. 56% of kids in this country with intellectual or developmental disabilities spend their entire day in self-contained, separate settings just for kids with disabilities, whether it's classes or separate schools. Even though we know, and all the research says, that is not going to yield better outcomes for them. Advocate for inclusion. Advocate for inclusive education. So why do we continue to segregate kids at such a high rate when we know the statistics don't support it? Why do we do it? Well, we know that sometimes when you do things for a long time in society, it's hard to change, right? You just get into certain habits that this must be the way to do it. But I think about this all the time. What's it going to take to change that dynamic so that so many kids are not being segregated? And I've come to believe that maybe it's really not about Samuel or Todd. Maybe it's not primarily about them. Maybe it's actually about the other kids. Maybe we need to show that inclusion benefits typical kids without disabilities as much or more than they benefit Samuel or Todd. The truth is that there are all these research studies that are being done at universities that show academic benefits for typical kids who are learning in inclusive settings. And there's one particular study that was done at Vanderbilt where they did 2 groups of kids they studied. One group were in an inclusive environment alongside their peers with disabilities. One group was separated from their peers with disabilities. The group that worked alongside their peers with disabilities had an average of a 15-point increase in their academic achievement. And what they did is they figured out why that happened. And it was because when you're working collaboratively with a peer, with a friend, with somebody who might need a little extra assistance or some coaching, you're much more engaged in the curriculum. You want to understand it, you want to study it. So those kids were so engaged because they had this friend that they wanted to make sure that they were a good collaborator with. So they achieved at a higher rate. Maybe it's about your son, your niece, your nephew, your grandchild. What kind of world do you want them to grow up in? When they have, let's say, a grandparent that develops Alzheimer's or has a stroke and suddenly starts moving in a very different way or talking in a different way, do you want them to think that's weird and freaky and that they are scared of that? When they have a cousin that's born with Down syndrome or autism, do you want them to feel scared and distant and uncertain how to approach that cousin? Or do you want them to know that this is a natural part of life? What kind of world do you want them to grow up in? Who do you want them to be? Who do they want to become? Advocate for inclusion. This is life. This is part of our world. It has to be seen as a normal part of our world.